All right. Hi, everyone. We got a couple people together to talk about co-teaching today, so we thought we would broadcast it. And that way, if anybody is interested in our discussion and what we're talking about, you can watch it at a later time. I'm Katie Tupple, and I'm an ELD specialist in a K-5 setting, elementary school, and I co-teach in kinder and first grade, which is the students' official ELD time. And then I also co-teach in third grade and fourth grade during reading time. To support teachers and support my ELs, particularly in vocabulary development. And I also co-teach in first grade. Sorry, my dehumidifier went on. I also co-teach in first grade, which again is just support in during their reading time and trying to bring in language development strategies in conjunction with what the classroom teacher is teaching. In my district, we have an adapted reading program, and so that's primarily the curriculum that we're using for co-teaching, which means that we have a different theme every week, which can be challenging because it's just constantly changing. So we're not working in elongated thematic units. It's this week we're learning about, and the next week we're learning about families and just that constant changing, because it's with younger kids, and that's just the way it's formatted. Beth, do you want to share about you?
Sure. My name is Beth Puma, and I currently teach overseas. I teach at an American school in Tokyo, Japan. I currently co-teach grades 3 to 5, but I have experience in the K to 12 co-teaching scenario. I am lucky because at international schools we have some flexibility. The curriculum we're using is an American curriculum, but I get to push into the classes, the subject areas, really depending the need of the unit. I'm excited to meet everybody.
Deanne?
Hi, I am Deanne Morales. I teach in an elementary school, grades K to 6. This year, I am co-teaching in first grade and fifth grade. In first grade, it is during their writing time, and in fifth grade, it's during their English language arts time.
Cool. Deanne was the one who kind of reached out and suggested getting some people together to talk about co-teaching. So thanks, because it's always cool to have different perspectives and just learn from each other and see. And Janie?
Yeah, I'm Jamie Badger, and I'm co-teaching in a middle school, grades 6 through 8. I'm in a 8th grade ELA course and a social studies 8th grade, which is U.S. history, and also a 7th grade social studies, which is geography. And then I also teach two my own classes, a sheltered academic language course for 6th grade, and then also a 6 through 8 EL 1, 2, and 3 level sheltered course.
Let's kind of roll off talking about planning, because that's one of the challenges in co-teaching is how do you plan with the variety of teachers that you have to collaborate with? What have you found to be challenging, or what works for you? And kind of, do you plan a week at a time? Do you plan a whole unit at a time? What does that look like for you guys?
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. So I just recently started trying to meet with my co-teachers. The challenge of that is I'm losing 3 of my planning hours per week. So that's been challenging for me then in prepping for my other classes. And with co-teaching 3 different courses, I'm struggling to keep up, feeling like a student sometimes. But what's working is at least having the materials from one of the co-teachers, so I know what's happening. We're doing it basically a week at a time for the ELA. So at least I know the materials that we'll be covering the next week. So if I have some extra time, I can kind of familiarize myself. The social studies is kind of getting concepts and what chapter we're on and what type of subjects and topics we'll be talking about, but sometimes not really getting the materials until the day we're doing it or a few days ahead. So that's been a little bit challenging. But I will say that, at the beginning of the year, we weren't meeting at all, and I was kind of walking in cold every day. But through, I think we started in January, really carving out a meeting time every week for each different teacher. And that actually has been a bit more helpful, I would say.
One of the schools in my district, the other school that co-teaches, said that the ELL teachers meet with each grade level once a week. And that just seems like a lot. It's a lot of meetings. For each grade level, it's once a week. But then for the ELL teacher, it's a meeting every day on top of other responsibilities. Exactly. For me, I'm part-time. So I'm only in the building from 8:15 to 12:15. And so there's literally no feasible way that I can meet in person with the teachers that I collaborate with. So last year, we really primarily collaborated via email, and it worked, and it was successful. And luckily, the teachers that I co-teach with are friends of mine. And so you can text on the weekend, and it just became just, at any random time, your email or your texting. And I try to, on Wednesday of the week prior, email and get a sense of what they're going to be doing, and then kind of come up with plans on my own, and then email again to give them the information of what I plan to do. It was a lot of exchanges like that. And when I got the opportunity to observe other teachers in my district, they were using Google Docs, and they were beautiful. And I just had this moment of, oh, that makes a lot more sense than email, because it's a great archive. So I've started to use their format, and that's really, really nice, because then you can include, it looks nicer and it's archived, but it's also a great way to specifically show what the standards are that they're working on, and then what language forms and functions I'm going to use, what standards I'm going to be covering, kind of the sequence of the lesson plan. And then I'll also include, if we're going to do a video, include the link, or if we're going to do a book, include a picture of the cover. And so it's a lot more comprehensive, so that if for some reason I'm not there and the sub needed to go on those plans, it's very detailed. And so we've been liking that, but I find it very, very helpful in this particular instance that we have a prescribed curriculum, because I can access it online. So I can go on and I can know exactly the books that they're going to read for their read alouds. I can know exactly what skills they're working on, what their sight words are, what sound they're doing. Any of that information I have access to without kind of having to bother them to find it out. And then I can come up with some solid plans before we engage in that cooperative planning. So it's kind of not as time consuming, because typically I'll come up with something, and really, since my colleagues haven't had any kind of training in co-teaching, they're super agreeable. They're like, oh yeah, Katie, that sounds great. Go for it. And so it's great, but at the same time, it's collaboration to an extent, but it's a lot more of, we're really just infusing the general ed classroom with great language strategies. And then once we're in the context that we're both teaching, they're diving in and they're helping. And some teachers are a little bit more involved in the lesson than others. But it just kind of, it flows, and they're the expert on their content and on writing and what they want to do, what they're expecting at each stage of the school year, particularly in kindergarten. And then I'm the language expert. We kind of tag team, and I've read in books that that's not what co-teaching is about, but for us, it works that we sequence it, that there's a language lesson, and the kids are always doing partner talk, so that whatever the language focus is, they're practicing it with a partner, and then they're going to write about it. And so it's a nice handoff, but yet we're in it together throughout the whole thing. Once the students are writing, I'm obviously supporting my ELLs, and the classroom teacher is supporting the other students. And sometimes it's everybody, it's not my students, your students, we're all in it together, but I'm trying hard to focus on my 3 or 4 ELLs in that classroom. With my first grade classes, I'm not aligning my co-teaching with their reading program. And so it's a lot harder, because it's kind of it's a science theme, or maybe it's a like social skills theme, or maybe it's Read Across America week, or maybe it's just very different. And so I don't get as much detail about, if I want to read the story that they're going to read, or that I'm going to read, I have to go and track it down and get the copy of the book so that I can read it, and then think of what language would go with that. And so that's a lot harder. And, in most situations, I think there's not that like tight prescribed curriculum that everybody is expected to implement. And I like that. But in this particular context, having the curriculum is helpful, because I can't get back to school for meetings, and I guess we could do it virtually or something, but we've found ways to make it work kind of remotely through technology, and so far so good. I don't know if we keep adding another grade level every year, if it will continue to work so smoothly, but we kind of just take it a little bit at a time, and we are seeing really positive results for students. So that gives me confidence to feel like what we're doing is good. Any other like tips about planning or struggles with planning that anybody has experienced?
I offer because I have 5 co-teachers right now. The most I've had is 9 at one time.
That's a lot.
It's a lot, yeah. So I was lucky they hired another ELL teacher here at my school. So there's 2 of us now in the K-5. I offer my teachers the choice of when their planning is, which is difficult for me, but ultimately I want them to see co-planning as like an asset and a valuable experience. So it's I either offer like once a week during my lunch or after school, unfortunately, or once in a cycle. Our cycles are 9 days during a planning. And so I typically found that teachers that have taught with me before, my co-teachers that I've had for a couple of years, they want once a week. And then because we're into a rhythm, it's very efficient that, yeah, we can do a 20-minute lunch meeting. And that's really wonderful. And then I find that teachers that are new to co-teaching, they're like, yeah, once every 9 days is fine. So that one's a little bit trickier, but we're getting there for sure. And so, and then I also am required to attend grade level meetings. So I go to one every 9 days for grades 3, 4, and 5. And so then I do have a general sense, and they keep it to curriculum during those meetings. So I have a general sense of the units, and I have access to all of that in the way we archive our units. So even if I'm not privy to the discussion around the final assessment at the end of the unit, I can access that through the way we archive. I find that particularly the co-teachers, like I have some that I've been with 3 years at this school, which is beautiful, and we can co-plan for a week in 10 minutes because they know what it looks like, right? So they tell me the content target, I try to figure out the language target, and then we think about the co-teaching model that works and what any scaffold. I always say, like, here's some scaffolds I can do, but at this point they're scaffolding too without me. So it's pretty beautiful. And I always this is my favorite question. What might we make different? So what might be differentiated? And that's beautiful. Yeah, that's the beautiful part. So, the co-teachers where it's my first year co-teaching with them, it takes longer just because they're still constructing what a co-taught classroom looks like.
Yeah, I typically, like when we got permission to start in kindergarten, I really just went in and was an observer for a week just to kind of get my bearings. And I had taught kindergarten before, and I had taught with those teachers on their team. So there was so much familiarity. It was a great place to start. But I just kind of supported, and I guess if you want to stretch it, it was kind of the one teacher teaches on purpose model, but really I was just helping. And that felt really uncomfortable to me because there's so much emphasis that you are not just an assistant. And so that's when I kind of said, can I lead? Can I take over the lesson? And then, they were totally fine with that. And it just kind of, came to fruition, and you feel like, I'm glad that there's so many different models and so many different ways that co-teaching can play out, because it gives me the confidence that it doesn't have to be perfect every day, and it doesn't have to be this. It can be a variety of things. Like when I push into 3rd and 4th grade, we're just doing separate groups. And so I don't really plan together, and I don't need to know exactly what the classroom teacher is doing when she sees her kids, because I'm doing a separate group and I'm working on vocabulary. And so I get the vocabulary from the curriculum that they're using. And then I there's like 10 vocabulary words a week. And then there's a vocabulary different skill, whether it's homophones, or this week we did adages and proverbs. And I just come up with lessons, and, she trusts that I'm doing good stuff and she's doing something different. And that's kind of a nice situation, because I see 2 groups a day, and she knows that they're benefiting, and I know they're getting something else from her, but there's not a lot of planning that's required. But I think that there's a little bit more freedom in that context because it's not their ELD time. Whatever they're getting during that time is bonus vocabulary development or bonus language development, but it's not that kind of scary accountability that this counts as their English language development instruction. Because there are days in the other grade levels where you just feel like the science content really takes over because they're doing something hands-on, and I feel like I didn't do my job to really develop language. I did give them, you know, some sentence frames for how they can interact with each other, but was that enough? And so I kind of like the routine of what we have going in kindergarten because I feel so confident that the kids are getting, you know, they use the acronym SWIRL. They're getting speaking, writing, reading, and listening in every lesson, and it's really solid. But it's a lot more floundering, especially in the first year when you're doing it in a different grade level, of feeling like, and we don't even have administrators that really have experience in it, or, you know, nobody's kind of checking you to say, well, are you thinking about this? Or are you doing, it's all on our own. It's all on us. So kind of feels like, I sure hope we're doing this right, because there's so much to think about, and really to not have a lot of professional development, especially professional development together, because you're teammates, that, you know, that's so important because you need to be hearing the same thing in order to be on the same page. And it's not exactly the same if I go and say, oh, I heard this. It's, you know, we need to be doing that together and working on our understanding of co-teaching as kind of a system together. How do you guys feel about co-assessment? Because that's my biggest like weakness / area of I just feel like we're not getting it. I know the kids are doing well, but we don't have a formal system for really evaluating them based on our co-teaching. And so I'd love to know more what other people do with that.
I feel like that's another struggle for myself as well. We are able to co-plan. I only have 2 co-teachers, and I meet with each one for a half hour. We have a half hour before students arrive each day. And so it fills up all of those precious morning minutes for doing other things. But it's great just to be able to, just to be able to be face-to-face. And the co-teacher comes with the content for the week kind of planned more or less what would be helpful. And then I come in with some different strategies, some ways of differentiating for particular learners, some English language learners and some of the other learners as well, and go from there. But like you had mentioned, that co-assessment piece is a little bit trickier. I think admin especially still sees the classroom teacher as the person responsible for that piece. And so it just makes it a little bit trickier.
Yeah, I mean, we have our ELPA test. That's what we use for our annual. Are you guys WIDA states or?
I'm a WIDA.
Yeah. What about you?
WIDA.
Yeah. Okay. So we use ELPA 21. So that's coming up. And so obviously we have a way to measure kind of on the grand scale how students are improving with their language development. But in terms of kind of the day-to-day, if we're sitting down to together talk about how well students met the target and what we would do differently, that just, it doesn't happen because I'm helping, working with kids, and then all of a sudden, oh, gotta go because I have to run to the other end of the building to support another classroom. And so kind of that wrap up doesn't always happen. But the thing we do is I will teach the same lesson in 2 different kindergarten classrooms on back-to-back days. So if I teach in the first classroom and something doesn't really go well, or it's too hard, or it's too easy, we'll talk about it, and then I can easily make changes for the next class. And so that kind of reflection piece can happen quickly, but not a formal assessment where we've got this data. And I read so many books about assessment this summer, and Margot Gottlieb has such a good book on assessment. And it's like, yeah. And then just, it's so hard to keep a record or really be cognizant of that in the moment, because I'm working with kids the entire time until I'm like, oh, I have 1 minute to go to the next classroom, and then off I dash. So that's really an area where I support professional development, but it just seems like it's going to look so different in every classroom that it's hard to really learn? I don't know. That's where I'm kind of just feeling lost.
I often start my co-planning with and I pick one of the lessons from the previous week and say, how do you think that went? That part. And then we just kind of debrief and then say, okay, what strategies felt right there and what might we try next time? So I start my co-planning with that question because you're right, like the urgency of the day, you don't always get to debrief. Also, I really try when we're co-teaching to have like the last 10 minutes as closure activities, and they're often something verbal and something, like line up or inside outside circles, so that we're both listening and that becomes our data, or like a ticket out or something. So it's a quick touchstone. We try, and this doesn't always happen, obviously, but we try to have a 10-minute closure activity so that we kind of know where the kids were. As far as like formal co-assessing, we're just putting our toe in it this year, and it's the third year of co-teaching for English language learners. There's a couple of pieces, like I'll pull things they're doing in class anyway through Seesaw or through a writing piece, and I'll assess it using the WIDA one of the WIDA rubrics formatively, and then I share that information. And then in the places where the co-teaching relationships really developed, we'll sit down and look at their summative assessments together, and we look at first through the lens of the standards and then through the lens of the language. And it's not formal, it's not documented per se outside of our co-teaching notes, but it helps us inform what's for the next unit. There have been a few times where, and again, there's only 3 EAL teachers K-12 in my school, 3.2, something like that. So most people don't understand what the idea of even English language proficiency and ELD standards. So we have a lot of freedom. So we're really trying out and also internationally, I don't have the state restrictions that you all do. So we're trying out the California ELD standards because they're aligned with Common Core and they're a little more specific, I find, than WIDA. And so there have been a few times where the content teacher says this child's beginning, and I'll say, well, if we look at it through the lens of proficiency, this child's actually meeting, their language just is developing, and that type of idea. So there have been a few times I've pushed a little bit, and sometimes it's worked out and sometimes it hasn't, and that's okay. That's part of that efficacy building of like content teachers around what English language proficiency is. So it's kind of the three, like the micro at the lesson level compared to like report card time and pushing back a little bit.
Yeah, that seems like, report cards, I'm still doing them separately. I'm grading for language standards and the classroom teachers are, and we didn't collaborate on that at all. It seems like there is such kind of a spectrum of where you can be, and you really just have to take it like you said, Beth, in year 3 you're really dipping into co-assessment, and so you kind of have to first get it established, and then once you're up and running, then you can just think about the different elements, because there is a lot. It's not
I'm sorry, I was wondering, Katie, you mentioned about the report cards. So we don't have any separate report cards for English language development. And that's interesting that you mentioned that. I was curious if the other teachers have separate report cards for those.
We don't report on standards right now out to, the rest of the content teachers do, but the EAL teachers don't. I just am required to write a narrative. And then so what I do is I use the ELD standards that guide my instruction to write those.
At my district, only level 1 learners or students receive a different report card for ELA, just because the language is so different at that point of learning.
Ours are just 10. We have 10 ELP standards that are part of the report card. And then as specialists, we're told that over the course of the year, we have to report on all of them. and we're supposed to report on 7 or 8, 9, and 10 each term, because those are kind of more of the actual language versus the standards that are a lot more similar to the Common Core English Language Arts standards. Like they can basically in a gist, they can understand what's being read and presented to them. They can have conversations about it. They can write about it. They can speak about different topics, tell their opinion, things like that. Those are kind of what they hit on, and those overlap for sure with what the classroom teachers are grading them on. Yeah. And Beth, you mentioned Seesaw. That's a great idea, because we do have iPads, and our first grade and kindergarten classrooms have them and use them. And the third grade teacher I work with uses Seesaw for everything, and students are sharing their work and parents are connected. And that seems like a great way, because I have to rely on technology because you don't have the time to be in there. I'll leave when students are still writing. And so even though I've built them up with the language to be able to write about the topic they've learned about, I don't get to see the finished product. So that would be something super easy to take a picture of their writing, upload it to Seesaw, and then when I'm home, I can check on my iPad or my computer and see. And I don't necessarily have to check for every kid in the class. I can really focus in on those few language learners to see what they produce. So that's a really good idea to try to get more teachers using that, because it's such a great way to have that archive.
And then even if I'm not in a lesson, because I'm only in how many times a week, right? If I'm not in a lesson and they're posting to Seesaw, I can leave feedback for them. So they know.
Yeah.
I'm always there.
And it's a great way to capture language too. Because when I was doing pullout ELD, I used it for all my different grade levels. And when it came time for report cards, that was a lot of, you can remember vaguely what kids say, but it's documented because they would record and they would write, and it's all there. So that's, I might have to start. Again, though, teachers need professional development. It's hard to just say, okay, you need to use Seesaw because it's going to help me. It would be kind of a process to get it up and running, but it is such a valuable resource to have access to so much good information and work that the kids produce. Jamie, what were some of the challenges that you are experiencing as part of co-teaching?
Well, we talked about the planning time. And I think Beth also talked about just like it's a new experience. So developing that relationship and getting your co-teachers on board. I think for me too, it's just the different curriculum, because I am an ELA teacher as well. So the push-in ELA grade 8 is a little easier for me. But balancing the content area of geography for 7th grade, history for 8th grade, and I have a newcomer in each of those grade levels, in addition to other proficiency levels. That's been my biggest challenge, is just keeping up with the content, because I don't feel like an expert there. So I feel like I'm trying to learn what they're doing so that I can, differentiate or accommodate, and that's been a big struggle for me.
Yeah, I agree, because it's hard to. I was just reading. I have Andrea's and Maria Dove's. They're one of their newest books, and I just started reading it, and it talks about how in your partnership, it's shared expertise.
Yeah,
but you can't rely on the content teacher to know all the content, and you just help with the language, because you need to truly know the content in order to know how the language fits in and how students can use that language as a vehicle to demonstrate, to understand, and then demonstrate understanding of the content. So you have to. I was studying the phases of the moon earlier this year, and you're having to learn it, because that's not something I've ever taught before. So there were several science things where I felt kind of out of my element, because I didn't know the content super well, and yet I was having to kind of present it to the students, because you can't present the language without knowing the content. Yeah. So it's kind of, you have to be double. I feel like possibly the content teacher can get away with really just knowing their content and then relying on the language teacher to bring in the strategies and whatnot. But for our role, it does seem like you have to be competent in both, which is hard, particularly at that level.
If we're truly dividing responsibilities, then I would have to know the content. And I sometimes feel at a loss, because, if a student's asking me a question, I'm kind of like, oh, let me check, But I feel like the model I've been using because of that has been more, if they tell me what they're doing, then I'm just trying to offer a strategy or how it could be a little, how we could present the information a little differently or accommodate the test or the quiz or the project or the reading material, reading level. So I feel like it's not a true representation of what the book that you just referenced is showing as far as, splitting the responsibilities. But at this point, it's the best I can do unless I was just solely doing the one content area. Maybe I could brush up a little more, but with 3 different content areas in my own classes, it's just really, it's a lot.
Yeah, I think it does quickly become just very overwhelming. Has anybody ever had an example of an experience working with a co-teacher that was really hard, like that you didn't mesh or that there was conflict or anything like that?
I would say for myself that anytime that I've tried to co-teach, but I wouldn't call it co-teaching, I would end up calling it push-in because it ended up being an assistant rather than 2 co-teachers. But more recently, whenever the co-planning piece has been more consistent, then it truly feels like co-teaching rather than push-in. And I think that's been the huge difference. It also, I think one has to be very intentional about selecting or choosing who you're going to co-teach with, because some content teachers are very passionate about what they do, but also hesitant to hand over some of that responsibility or share some of that responsibility for their students. So I think it depends on, that partnership.
Yeah, I've been lucky to work with people who are pretty open and flexible to letting me really do what I want to do. There's not a lot of pushback, but I've heard a colleague said they tried co-teaching in science and it didn't work because the classroom teacher was so focused on what they needed to teach and didn't really see the language teacher as an asset to help with that process. They saw it as something else being added that interfered with her ability to teach her content. And it didn't work out. It was frustrating for the language teacher because she just didn't feel like she was able to do what she needed to do. And so they ended up not continuing because it didn't work out. But we're lucky that we're in the point in time where we're really pushing to do this, and we are relying on teams who are willing to do it. So everybody is very eager and very flexible. I'm curious to see what happens because so far we've added a new grade level every year, and we'd like to do that. But I don't know that every single year we will have a grade level who is 100% wanting to do it. So it'll be interesting because I'm sure not every partnership is going to be one that really works. So
I think for me, the most successful co-teaching experiences I've had is when the classroom teacher, when the classroom is set up not so teacher-centered, because I feel like I can interject more and work in small groups, work with a variety of students. When you get into a classroom that's extremely teacher-centered, there's really, it's very difficult to add anything.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you guys use different co-teaching models in different classrooms, or do you tend to have kind of a favorite or one or two that you really stick with the most?
I just, based on my personality, like to switch it up a lot. And so I really, when I'm sitting down co-planning, we look at the target, we look at the need, and then decide from there. There are a few teachers, like where our alternative teaching, where I'm working with a small group and doing the lesson with a small group targeted to them, that's like the most comfortable. But for the most part, especially with my co-teachers over a couple years, it really depends on the target, the content and language target.
We tend to kind of do teaching together, which is known as the hardest. And in some cases it really works because the teacher is totally there with me, and we don't, it's not a script. You don't say, okay, well, you're going to say this, and it just happens. And it works perfectly. But then there are other times when I do feel like there's a little bit less engagement. But then again, I'll say, oh, can you come model with me? And then the teacher is part of us showing the students what it will look like when they interact and use the language. And then when we transition to writing, we're both there's so many kids that we're both busy and we're both interacting and supporting students. And I feel like it's never, I feel like I always have to try to give myself permission that that's okay. There's not a perfect way it's going to look. And if one teacher happens to be more involved in the moment than the other one, I don't see that as a terrible thing. Because I do think that the feedback I've been given from the teachers I work with is that they learn a lot of language strategies. And so I think it's so beneficial to be able to see other teachers teach. That's not something that we really get to do very often. And that's been my favorite part of co-teaching, is to see what management looks like in different classrooms, to see just how different teachers interact with their students, how they get their attention, how they hold their attention, how they keep them engaged. And for me to hear that they're learning from what I'm doing, I feel like that's valuable. Even if they're not interacting with the lesson, but they're really taking it as an opportunity to learn something from what I'm doing, I think that's valuable.
Yeah, agreed. I've learned a lot from hours and hours of observation, which is really unique because we often don't get to do that. So it is a very nice thing.
Yeah, I wish that was, there's that whole observe me movement going on where teachers set their schedule and invite other people. And I would love to do that. It's just one of those things that there's not time. Any teacher is welcome to come in and see me teach at any time, but they're teaching their kids. So without kind of that structure to organize that, it doesn't necessarily work. Anything else related to co-teaching that is on your mind or that you have questions about? You can also put questions out to other people who didn't join the chat. And Andrea is always a really good resource and always willing to answer questions if we want to float any her way.
I think one question that I still have is if in the co-teaching settings that you have, do you then see those learners at other points during the day as well for ELD development, or is it only in the co-taught setting where you see those students?
At my school, it depends. If the student is a newcomer, they will have additional language time. Like there's a student in my first grade class who just came from the Marshall Islands. And so he will get additional time outside of the time I'm in his regular classroom. For most students, if that is their ELD block, that is the language instruction they get. And for the kinder and first grades that I do, they're getting a lesson every other day. So they're not getting language instruction daily. They're getting a 45-minute lesson every other day. But the idea is that their classroom teachers are learning language strategies and then embedding language throughout. So it's not as if they're only getting isolated language every other day. It's kind of a trickle effect where then their teachers are able to implement other things in math and science and throughout their day whenever. But yeah, and then with the students who I see for third and fourth grade, when I'm working with their teachers, it's not their ELD time. So they do get pulled for 30 minutes and receive explicit ELD instruction in a pullout setting. And then my instruction with vocabulary is kind of just a bonus, because that's the way that schedules worked out, that I had time and can have kind of the luxury of trying it out with some different grade levels to see how it helps the students who are not struggling, but who are not as advanced in reading.
I'm similar. So my early speakers pretty much they'll receive extra ELD time. Unfortunately, it's during Japanese language instruction time. So once they move probably into around, like if they're in the WIDA 2 range for speaking, I'll exit them from the ELD time and push in more into their classroom. That's the idea. But we have that flexibility, again, not tied necessarily to state systems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things that is difficult with the pullout, is that even though our district mandate is that students don't miss any core instruction, they still miss something. And teachers can't be in a standstill, so they might miss something fun. You know, it always made me feel conflicted when their class goes to library during ELD time.
Mm-hmm.
Or their class goes for recess, for an extra recess during ELD time. They're still missing that. And so, you know, one of the greatest advantages of co-teaching is that they're just with their class and they're not made to feel different, which is, I just think, such a benefit. Yeah.
At my school, we've been doing something similar where level 1 and 2 students have the additional time in a pull-out setting, and then everyone else just in the co-taught setting. And I feel like that pull-out time is still important, especially for those learners, just because they're working on a word set that is very different from the others, and just to have that base so that once they are in the regular classroom with their other peers, they have some more a more basis to go on.
Does anybody have a situation where when classes are constructed, English learners are placed based on the number of faculty available to support language learners? Like I've heard about, I think at Andrea's training, situations where particularly if there's a small number of ELLs, rather than having, say, 2 in each of 4 classrooms, all 8 might be in one classroom so that the single ELD teacher can support that classroom more often rather than rotating. Has anybody's school tried that out?
Yeah, each grade level probably has about 5 classrooms, and they tend to cluster them into 1 or 2, so that more push-in time. And then perhaps the kids with other learning needs are clustered into the other classes so that the learning support special ed teacher can co-teach, and that doesn't always work out perfectly, but that's the attempt.
I feel like it makes sense logistically. I feel like sometimes there's the perception from the classroom teacher that that's not fair or equitable to the teacher who has more ELLs. Yeah, then if you counter that with, well, you have an additional staff member that's supporting you, it's just, you know, it's something that I think there is pushback around that particular idea. We also heard about a scenario where the ELD teacher would co-teach in a single classroom, just full day for, say, 6 weeks. So the 2 teachers would kind of just be both teachers, and then the ELD teacher is supporting everything, teaching language strategies, modeling for the classroom teacher. But then after that designated unit or amount of time, the language teacher then moves on to cooperate or collaborate with a different teacher, with the understanding that the teacher that had previously been the partner would carry on the language strategies and stuff like that. And that seems like also an interesting model, because then you really do get to know the kids and know everything that's going on in their day, and you can model how to infuse language in a variety of content areas, not just this one isolated lesson. Because I think that there are probably cases where while the co-teacher is there, there's so much language, and then when the co-teacher leaves, it's, you know, back to just maybe not as language rich, or, you know, going back to kind of old habits, or just the way that they do it by themselves, because it's different when you don't have that second person in your room.
Well, that's one of my goals, is to just have teachers realize that we are all language teachers. And so if you are teaching math, you're teaching your students how do mathematicians speak and think, and geographers, historians, scientists. And so I feel like that work would be, you know, most beneficial to students, as you're saying, because when we do leave and we're not there, then does everything stop happening, because we're not in there promoting that. But if we approach all of the lessons, no matter your content area, as you are a language teacher, in addition to teaching content, I think that is most helpful, and to more than EL students.
Lots of different things to try out. That's why I think it's hard to kind of go from a total pullout model district-wide to co-teaching, because it kind of needs to be in waves for people to try things out and see what works. But then just because this works for me in this kindergarten classroom doesn't mean it's going to work for another kindergarten teacher and another ELD specialist at a different school with a different kid dynamic or different, it doesn't necessarily work. And so it kind of is like, do we just roll it out all at once and everybody dive in, or do we roll it out slowly, and can we really learn from each other? I feel like, again, my district wants to kind of systematize it, and I see elements where you certainly can, but then I worry that it's going to be too much of this is what it's going to look like. And part of the reason I love co-teaching so much is because I perceive that I have so much more freedom than I would if I was a classroom teacher and mandated to use this, 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 and this. And so I like to be creative and to make up songs and bring in things, and just, it feels like I get to do that all the time and highlight what's really fun about teaching. So I'm curious to see how a district can go from one model to another, and what the process will be and what the success level will be, because certainly not everybody will be sold on it. There's that people who will say, yes, this is amazing, to the people who say, no, absolutely not. I don't want anything to do with that. And then for a certain amount of time, you can start collaborating with the people who are interested, but then you get to a point where what happens if that person is so resistant? But now that you're with that grade level, it just seems like that would be such a challenge. And there's so many questions I have about how it's going to roll out for the future. I wonder.
One thing that my school did this year, and again, I know we're a district of one school, is that, and again, it's probably the third or fourth, it's the third year for really English language learner co-teaching. It's the fourth year for other types of co-teaching. But we have co-teaching agreements this year. And so we all sat down and we said, what does co-teaching at our school look like? And what is co-planning, co-teaching, co-assessing? And we co-constructed agreements. Obviously, I tried to influence a little bit what that would look like as being the person who's done it for a while. And it's not perfect, but the idea of agreements, and if we hit a bump in the road, that we take them out and we look at them, that's been really helpful. And then in terms of resistant teachers, or just for all the reasons, right? Maybe they're not resistant, but it comes off that way, right? Mm-hmm. I really try to use that. It's not about me. It's not about you. How can we help this kid continue to grow, and how can we help this child's language and content understanding? And I try, especially when it's starting to get hit a bump in the road, it's about the kids and not us. Easier said than done, though. So mm-hmm. I recognize that, but that's what I try.
Of agreements, and I've read about that. It's something that we didn't do because when we got permission in kindergarten, we just dove in and we had no professional development. So I didn't at that point in time know that we should take certain preliminary steps before we just started. And then we literally got permission to co-teach the day that we started in first grade. So I did take that time to observe, but we never had that time to sit down and say, okay, this is what it should or shouldn't look like. And I did give some resources to my colleagues, but we never had that conversation of here are my rules for my classroom that you need to know, so that when the kid comes and says, can I go to the bathroom, to you, that you know what my answer would be. And those things are important, because kids do learn that you're this other adult, and they kind of learn that balance of who's in charge, but who might not know what the teacher would expect. And I feel like you could be taken advantage of, or just be in a situation where you don't really know what the teacher would want. So those things are important to discuss. During this time, bathroom breaks are okay or not, or during this time, snacks are okay or are not, so that you can be able to say, okay, well, this is not a time where you can have that snack right now. I'm not sure why you're eating when you're in my group, because things like that happen. So yeah, I feel like that is a very, a good pearl of wisdom in beginning any co-teaching relationship, is to have that time to sit down and just this is my teaching style. I do this. One of my third grade teachers, the third grade teacher I work with, said, she's noticed that I don't always require kids to raise hands. because I don't always like to require kids to raise hands. And I sometimes ask a question and it's more of a popcorn free flow. And she always requires kids to raise hands. And so she realized that it was important to address with the students, you guys know that I expect you to do this, and Mrs. Topple expects you to do this. And so you might have to behave differently depending on which teacher is leading you in that moment. And that's very important. So you have to either agree to be on the same page or agree that teacher 1 will do this and teacher 2 will do this. And the students need to know the difference, which I guess can be hard for students, but at the same time, even to go from their classroom to PE or to music, they do have different expectations that they learn. So know that they're not with that person or something like that. Anything else on your minds about co-teaching? Any particular like resources that you found helpful to get information about your process, or anything that you find inspiring?
I mean, Andrea's work, obviously.
Yeah. Obviously, yes.
Yeah. Keeps me honest.
Yeah.
And then I just love when teachers post videos of co-teachers. Not post it, like when they're talking about it. So I just love seeing that from around the world, what co-teaching looks like in a science classroom in China, and what co-teaching looks like in a classroom in Arizona. I just love when teachers tell their stories, and yeah, that's something I seek out, whether through Twitter or
Andrea and Maria do have, and in this book too, I just started it, but they have QR codes that link to videos. So that's cool, because then you can see it, because reading about it and seeing it in action is different. But on Teacher Channel, they have a lot of different videos that show, and even videos that show what co-planning looks like, or videos that show what co-teaching looks like in this model versus this model. And so those things are very helpful, because especially when you're kind of trying to be the pioneer within your own instructional setting, you don't have other people to look to see what it looks like. When we got to go watch at the other school that co-teaches, that was very helpful. And I do it with kinder and first, and they were third and fourth. They're doing it in science. I'm doing it with reading, but it was still really great to just see what it looks like. And I left with some takeaways of things that I started to implement, particularly with planning, right away. So it is really helpful to see other people do it and learn from that.
I've been picking the brains of our special education teachers. They have been co-teaching for years and years and years.
Oh, really?
In our district, from grades 6 through 12. And so it's been really helpful for me, because although co-teaching isn't new to our district, is new as an ESL teacher. So I have been really talking to them about, what does it look like when you're going into this class, or what are your responsibilities? How do you plan? How do you keep up with the content and things like that? Although we have different roles, it's just still some things are very consistent across the board with co-teaching, and can transfer from whether it's special ed or ESL.
Interesting. And we don't have co-teaching, at least at the elementary level, for special education. It would more, I mean, there's instructional assistants that push in, but that's not the same model. But I have noticed that a lot of information about co-teaching does talk about a special education context, and the content teacher collaborating with the special education teacher, but definitely still a valuable resource to be able to kind of get information from that and then apply it to our situation. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for joining today. It was fun chatting, and it's good to know some other people who co-teach, that, just to kind of continue the conversation when things come up over Twitter. And I'll post a link to this in case, because I know there were a couple other people who were on the thread that had said they were interested, and obviously life happens and things come up, and they might be interested to watch the discussion and hear what we chatted about.
Thanks so much for organizing this.
Yeah. Well, thank you for Deanne for suggesting it.
Thank you.
Great idea.
The conversation as well. There's been some helpful strategies and resources that were shared, and so I'm grateful for the time that you took to chat today.
Oh, yeah, no problem. It was really fun. Well, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. You
Thank
too.
you.
Okay. Bye.